All right. Thank you very much, Professor Ramirez. I should tell you a little bit about myself, maybe. I grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago. My dad grew up and was born in Chicago. My mom was born in Mexico and immigrated here when she was about 16 years old in the very early 1960s. And so I spent my entire life in the Chicagoland area. Went to the University of Illinois, where I currently teach as an adjunct professor as well in the nuclear engineering department there. But I've spent my entire career at Argonne. And it's interesting when you think about starting a career, you really have no idea where things are going to take you. You think you might have a clue, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life, but it's really interesting to see how a career evolves. And so this is what the topic of this talk is. Even though it's given the topic of decontamination R&D at Argonne, it's really a story about how my career has evolved. And this is only part of my career. There's other things that I've done, a lot of other things that I've done in addition to what I'm going to be talking about today. But I think this one tells kind of a very neat story. So we started off, I should start off here. Decontamination is a process by which you remove contamination from surfaces. And so I've been specifically involved in radioactive decontamination, nuclear and radioactive decontamination my entire career. My PhD is in nuclear engineering, so I learned how to operate nuclear reactors, how to design them, how nuclear weapons are, the physics behind nuclear weapons. But I was always extremely interested in chemistry. I was much more interested in chemistry than I was in engineering when I first started. But as I started to learn the mathematics of engineering, I fell in love with the mathematics. But all of my electives were in chemistry. And so I spent a lot of my time learning the chemistry of radioactive and nuclear compounds. I did my undergraduate research at Argonne National Laboratory in their chemical engineering division. And what they did was all the chemical side of the nuclear fuel cycle. And I learned how to perform what they call selective separations, how to separate, for instance, uranium and plutonium from dissolved nuclear fuel. You dissolve the nuclear fuel, which has every element in the periodic table in it, and yet we can pull out uranium and plutonium to incredibly pure and high yields. And the whole process, the whole reason why anybody wanted to do that was because they wanted to make nuclear weapons. That's how we got into that business, was in World War II, right before World War II. And so my division at Argonne, we've been involved with developing and designing facilities to essentially purify plutonium for nuclear weapons. And there's a whole bunch of sites in the nuclear complex around the country that does this. But after the Cold War had ended in the early 1990s, it was decided that the Department of Energy, who owned all of these facilities to process nuclear fuel, that they needed to get rid of the facilities because they were now they had become a burden on the taxpayers because they were extremely expensive to run, and yet we weren't making nuclear weapons, so there really wasn't any need for all of these massive facilities spread out across the entire country. And so they started to disassemble them. But they were processing nuclear fuel, so it was extremely radioactive in all the laboratories. And in some of the facilities, they'd have piping where they would be piping the radioactive material around. And you'd get leaks in the pipes, and so you'd have areas that were contaminated. The pipes were contaminated. The air duct system was contaminated from powders of radioactive material, and so the whole place was contaminated. And so they were trying to figure out, how are we going to decontaminate all of this stuff, because you can't demolish a building when there's a whole bunch of radioactivity around, because as soon as you start knocking down the building, the dust throws the radioactivity up in the air, and then all the workers are breathing the radioactivity. So it's an extremely unsafe condition. And so they were trying to figure out how do we decontaminate all of the concretes and the steels, and can we sell back the steel? Because some of these facilities were using extremely expensive steels because of the process used. The process of dissolving fuel uses strong acids and sometimes the nastiest of the strong acids, like hydrochloric acid and nitric acid, and sometimes they would use hydrofluoric acid. So they would often use exotic metals, and so it was extremely expensive, and they didn't want to throw it away if they didn't have to. And so they were trying to come up with all kinds of ways. And so I've been involved from the beginning was to lower the nuclear fuel print, but my career evolved away from that. So I'm going to talk briefly. If I move my cursor here, can you see my cursor moving on the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to start here where we talked about our work in the Department of Energy. And then that led to a number of different inventions where we were looking at worker-friendly decontamination process, and I'll explain what that is. And then it finally got us into today's areas of looking at wide area decontamination and helping out our military and our other departments with decontamination needs. So the first area we got involved in, this was supposed to be my PhD project, incidentally. It was the master's project for a friend of mine who was at the University of Illinois as well and was doing his research with Argonne. But in order to find out whether decontamination techniques worked on contaminated steels, we had to develop our own coupons to figure it out, because they weren't going to be cutting these real materials apart and sending them in the mail around to all the facilities so that they could test it. It just wasn't going to happen. And so we worked with a metallurgist at the Nuclear Engineering Department at the University of Illinois. And the idea was to take these, so this is an electron microscope image of stainless steel. And here you can see the grain boundaries. So these are individual grains, which are like, they're like crystals. Individual grains inside the metal, and the grains are bonded together. And these are continuous in terms of heat transport and everything. It's just that the way that the structure of the crystal is lined up, you can see very clearly these different grains. And what happens when you get old contaminated material is that this shininess and flat surface becomes much more roughened. The grains become much wider. The opening in the grains become much wider. You get corrosion pits on the surface, and that's where the radioactivity hides. And so the processes of decontamination, usually they're wet chemical processes. You take the steel and you dip it in acid and try to dissolve out the radioactivity. Other techniques of decontamination are you scrub the surface, like physically you try to remove and scrape off all of these contaminated scales off the surface. So to test these techniques then, what we did was we applied an electric current to the coupons. And if you do it the right way, you can dissolve out preferentially the grains. The spaces in between the grains, and you can cause this pitting, this artificial pitting on the surface. And so that's what this middle image is a sample that's been treated electrochemically in order to open up and expose these grain boundaries. And then when we add radioactivity to it and then heat it up in an oven to cause to increase the diffusion of the radioactivity, we end up with a surface that looks like this. And so this would be the contaminated surface that we're going to be playing with in order to decide what types of decontamination techniques work better than others. And again, remember, the reason for doing this is that if we can define techniques that work well to decontaminate steels, then the idea was that the Department of Energy would employ these techniques in order to decontaminate the steel and possibly resell it as clean steel. And by the way, Xavier, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me right away. Don't wait until the end if your question is pressing, or if you need me to clarify something, then just go ahead and ask me right away. Don't worry about interrupting me. I'm not going to go into more detail with this, but we evaluated a lot of different chemical agents to decontaminate the steels, and then we gave our recommendations to the Department of Energy. And they started to decontaminate and demolish facilities quickly after that. We were never told how much of our work actually went into the development of the techniques and the choice of techniques that they used, but they went very aggressively to start decontaminating and knocking down these facilities. We do know that they were never able to resell any of the steel. Actually, the Department of Energy made a directive saying that it was illegal for the department to resell contaminated steel. So that was never realized.
So I have is well, I kind of expect that it will cost money for those techniques. How much would it usually cost, like, for you guys to like try different techniques out?
For us to do the research side of it, or for them to actually try techniques in the field?
To try techniques in the field.
Okay, for them to try techniques in the field. Decontamination and working in a nuclear facility or a contaminated facility, no matter which way you look at it, is very expensive. The personal protective equipment gear that's required and the safety documentation and safety training that's involved is extremely extensive, and for that reason is expensive. So I couldn't give you numbers on how much it would cost to trial these different types of techniques in the field, but these companies have a way of calculating out all of these different techniques, especially now. At that time, the decontamination industry was very, very young, and there was only a few companies that were involved in it. And so it was extremely expensive for all of them. And the Department of Energy, though, was spending a lot of money to get these companies to come in and try different techniques and see what works. And after those 20, 30 years now, they've got like a handbook on all the techniques and how to use them. And that's one of the reasons why these companies are extremely valuable, is because they know things that no one else knows. And a lot of these techniques they keep fairly close to their vest in order to protect the business side of it. So I'm sorry for kind of dancing around that question, Xavier, but I don't have a hard answer on how expensive it is. I can just tell you it is very expensive to do this. The research side was expensive. It was a few $100,000 just for us to do these studies on testing which techniques were going to work. So our experience in that, our immediate actual realization in that study was that the techniques that are very often used or promoted in the industry are really nasty. They're used very harsh chemicals. So these are, like I mentioned before, the hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, fluoroboric acids. These are the nastiest and the worst of the acids. They require a lot of personal protective equipment. You have to go in with breathers if you're going to use these techniques in the open, because the fumes from the acids would just knock you down. And so we started thinking about other processes that might be more worker friendly. And so we came across this molecule called the diphosphonic acid that had been invented by the Russians, but had been developed as a process at Argonne. And here's what the molecule looks like. Here's your phosphonic acid groups here. So it's a lot like phosphoric acid. In fact, if you heat this up, it degrades. This is supposed to be an arrow. If you heat this up, it degrades into carbon dioxide and water and phosphate to make phosphoric acid, or to make mineral phosphates. And the neat thing about this is that it's a strong organic acid. It has the ability to dissolve iron oxides, which are the corroded rust, very, very quickly. In fact, it can dissolve all kinds of scales, and I'll explain the pictures here in a second. The kinetics are very fast, much faster than even the mineral acids. And this doesn't have a strong odor, and it doesn't harm the skin. So you can stick your fingers in this stuff and not have to worry about you developing a rash, or even worse, from your skin or your bones. So it's very, very worker friendly. And when we did testing on this, we had found that this is kind of a crummy image of it, but this is a piece of metal that came from a nuclear power reactor. And the black here of the metal is the actual scale, the oxide scale that forms when metal gets old. And it's inside the scale, which is just a layer, a very strongly adherent layer of oxide metal attached to the base metal. And so the radioactivity hides inside of this. So when we treated it with the diphosphonic acid, well, this is the after picture of that coupon. So it comes out very, very clean. And it essentially dissolves out the entire scale. When we do a gamma image of it, so we take a gamma scan of the piece, we'd see that the before picture is the blue lines here. So these are the gamma peaks that are coming from the metal. The biggest one would be here. The biggest indicator would be cobalt, because cobalt circulates around inside the nuclear power plant. It becomes radioactive and then deposits all over the surfaces. And then this is the after scan. So you can see the cobalt has been completely removed because we were able to remove the scale. And so that got us to thinking about other types of worker-friendly compositions. And also this had been right after 9/11 now. So now we move into the 2000s. And there was a need within the Homeland Security Department to find a decontamination agent that can be used outside. They were worried about a nuclear or a radioactive bomb going off in Washington, D.C. And they didn't want to have to demolish the monuments, because that was the practice. If something's contaminated, you decontaminate it to a point where you can go in and demolish it. And that was not the option. And so we were looking at a way of building off our years of, at that point already, we had 10 years of experience in doing decontamination. And more importantly, we were the only ones thinking about worker-friendly decontaminants. And so I developed what was called the super absorbing gel. We call it the Argonne super gel. It's based on diapers. And that's how I got the idea, because my 17-year-old kid now, he was a baby at the time, and so I had this idea of spraying diapers onto a wall. And so if you picture a wall here, and then this is the surface of the wall, and it's got all of these pores that go in at so much depth into the wall, and it's really that porosity that creates the problem for decontaminating concrete. Now we're thinking about concrete and marble and granite. You know, think about Washington, D.C. Asphalt surfaces. And so the problem with the radioactivity is that they sit inside these pores. And so you can't just wash off the surface. You can't just spray down the surface, because it's not going to be as effective at getting the radioactivity out of the pores. And so the idea was that you would spray this diaper down, this diaper material over the contaminated surface. And because the diapers soak so much water, you would apply this as a wet diaper. And then and you could put salts and other types of, we call them chelating agents or getters. So these are chemicals that have the ability to bond to certain elements on the periodic table. But we added salts. We tried a whole bunch of different things, because we were using some of the similar chemicals that we had tested in years before when we were developing the diphosphonic acid, and then evaluating those other types of contaminants for the Department of Energy. And it turns out that you just need simple salts in here: potassium, ammonium salts. And if you're chasing cesium and potassium and cesium and ammonium are very, very similar chemically. What happens is you apply the diaper material down here, the ions of the potassium and ammonium go in, and they kick the cesium out of its bonded spot and put it into the pore water. And then the pore water is in constant exchange with the super absorbing gel on the surface. And so you can get the radioactivity to collect into the gel, and then you just vacuum off the gel. And so that process worked pretty well. And so here's a picture of what it looks like sprayed onto a surface here, and then it's vacuumed off here, and it comes off very nicely. So you get a nice, you don't get a slimy surface. It comes off quite nicely. And then this is a picture of it fully hydrated gel, just placed in a pan. We formed it to place it in the pan. And then when you dehydrate it, it's almost entirely water. So there's very little material there. And then this would go right into a radioactive waste disposal site. And I'll move on from that to get onto some of the other things. Because of our expertise in working with Homeland Security and developing the super gel, not only for the United States, but we had 2 foreign partners that were interested in developing the super absorbing gel. So that got the Department of Defense involved. And so they heard about the techniques that we had. And so after the Fukushima reactor accident, their Operation Tomodachi was the life-saving operations and the rescue missions that the United States Air Force and Navy were involved in. And when they went to go and respond in Operation Tomodachi, they were flying their planes and their aircraft carriers into the plume. They didn't know exactly where the plume was at the time. And at that point, they needed to do operations anyway. So the military just goes on and takes care of business. They're not going to avoid a radioactive plume if it's going to jeopardize the mission. And so they had a bunch of these fighter engines that were suspected of contamination. And so we developed a technique where we can take a gamma camera. This is a gamma detector right here. Detects the gamma rays that are coming from the radioactivity. So gamma rays are like X-rays, but they are the emissions, the dangerous emissions that are coming from radioactivity that can that penetrate through your body and can harm the DNA and stuff. We were scanning the gamma rays coming off the radioactivity, and we were placing it up against this fighter engine, this jet engine. And by doing some modeling that when I was younger was impossible, but now it's done on a laptop computer, you can calculate what by the measurement of radioactivity from this detector and knowing the geometry of this thing that looks very much like a cylinder. We could place check sources. So these are radioactive sources. We know exactly what the quantity of this radioactivity is on this side. And then we placed the detector on the other side. This is me and my friends from the U.S. Armed Forces, the Army Corps of Engineers. And we would place the detector on this side where I'm standing, and we would have the face of this detector facing these sources. And then by the amount of radioactivity that it's detected by the detector, and knowing how much is originally in here, we could calculate how much material the radioactivity must have penetrated through in order to get to the detector. And so we had a way of developing a technique then once we knew that, we knew what the structure of the inside of this entire jet engine was. And the computer would memorize it, and then we would be able to, we wouldn't use these check sources. Now we would take a contaminated engine, and we'd run the scanner along the entire side, and the radioactivity that was detected by that scan, the computer software would back calculate how much radioactivity was inside this engine. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Navy and Air Force can make a decision. Okay, we know how much radioactivity is in this engine. Is that too much? Do we need to dismantle the engine and decontaminate? Or is it only a little bit and it's within regulations that we can put the engines back onto the fighter planes? And it turned out almost every one of the engines had such a low amount of radioactivity, they were able to install them back onto the fighter planes. So this was a huge success, and it saved them probably in the tens to $100 million by being able to do these types of scans. And so they didn't need the decontamination techniques. And I'll pass by into what this started to, what this led to the work that I'm doing now. After 9/11, certainly there was an upsurge in concern over terrorism, terroristic use of radioactive and nuclear weapons. And so we were already, because of developing the supergel, we were thinking about what techniques can be used for monuments. So, you know, valuable items. But over the years, we were thinking about the more extensive problem of a radioactive or a nuclear detonation. So let me see if I can get this going. So in a nuclear detonation, this would be this is to scale as well. There would be a blast shock wave that would emanate from the detonation. So this is a rendition, and I hope it comes through entirely. This is a rendition of a 10 kiloton weapon. 10 kiloton weapon is a very small weapon. That was the one, that's about the size of the one that we developed first, that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today it would be considered a dud weapon because it just doesn't have the yield even close to what the nuclear weapons have. That's the picture, and that's the scale of the fireball that would go up. And so this whole area of downtown Chicago, there's no hope to really do much of anything there. That's really a lost cause. But it doesn't mean that you just give up. There's a whole bunch of areas outside that are going to be affected by this nuclear weapon going off. And so once the nuclear fireball goes up in the air, you would have the radioactivity blown up into the air, and it's shown by these particles here in this simulation. And it's going to go where the wind goes. And so the radioactive contamination can be really extensive. And so this shows over time how the contamination has spread. And so, you know, I grew up down about here in this area, which is, you know, about 8 miles from the city of Chicago. And you can see that this actually stretches all the way out to Notre Dame University. So there's an extensive amount of radioactive contamination that would have to be dealt with. And so we were thinking how you would do such a thing. This is another rendition of it, except the top view. And you can see the extent of the contamination. This is how many hours out after the detonation of that 10 kiloton weapon. And then over time, the radioactivity is going to die away. At 12 hours, it's peeled back a little bit because a lot of that radioactivity that's coming from a nuclear weapon actually dies away very, very quickly. It's got a very short, what they call half-life. The amount of time it takes before half of its radioactivity has already been gone and already died away. And then at 18 hours, you peel it back here. But here on this side, you can see this is South Bend, where the Notre Dame University is at. So this is 100 miles. So it's an extensive amount of area. And that wind happened to be blowing east and then blowing south that day when they ran the simulation. And so this is a realistic view of what the wind would do and where it would carry the radioactivity. Another type of release is a radioactive dirty bomb. So that's a radioactivity that's laced, explosives that are laced with radioactivity, and then you would detonate that. So this was a simulation that was done for a detonation in Denver. And so you'll see here, this is ground zero for it. And the detonation had gone off. The red is highly contaminated areas. The pinkish color here is a little bit less contaminated. And then once you get out to here, it's a little bit much less contaminated, what they're calling 15 millirem for a year, which is not a very large amount. It's a very small amount, but it's hard to explain to someone that, oh, no, you can go back into your house. Yeah, it's contaminated, but it's only contaminated a little bit. You know, you can imagine trying to convince people, and then, you know, people trusting the government. Oh, yeah, we're going to go back and live there. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So if I can pause it here. When this circles back, you're going to get a better impression of how many neighborhoods are involved in here. And so how would you clean something like this up? Because the people are going to want it clean before they go back in the house. So what do you do? How do you clean it up? What do you tell them? the government's not going to be able to handle such a case. And so how do you even start to handle such a situation like that? And in this picture here, so this is the boundary for 15 millirem. So you can say, okay, this neighborhood over here. So this street, and we're going to say that this street, if you live on this side of the street, it's contaminated. We're going to want to do some decontamination before you come back in the house, or you may want to do decontamination before you come back in the house. But on the other side of the street, you guys are fine. You can imagine people living on this side of the street and they're looking across the street and they're saying, well, what's the difference between that side of the street and this side of the street? How come I don't need to be decontaminated? So you have a bunch of social as well as economic and political issues to deal with. And now as this camera turns around and we look back at all of these neighborhoods here, you see how extensive and how many neighborhoods, picture the neighborhoods in Chicago and contamination spread everywhere. How do you do such a thing? So that's what I've been spending a lot of my time on these days. And so what we've been doing is thinking about how to use municipal and commercial equipment to carry out a RAD, radioactive response and recovery. So this isn't going to be equipment that's been used over the years for radioactive decontamination. This is going to be commandeering your bulldozers and your street sweepers and bladders to hold water and firefighting equipment. This is going to be using that type of stuff so that we can quickly decontaminate an area. One thing we know is that when contamination sits for a long period of time, it becomes harder and harder and harder to remove. But when contamination is fresh, it's actually quite easy to remove it. So if you can come up with these types of methods that use equipment that you can find down the street, rather than ordering a specialty equipment from a company and waiting 6 months for it to arrive, if you can do these things today, then you can perform a very efficient decontamination and get these neighborhoods up and running, rather than waiting 6 months, or in the case of Fukushima, they waited almost 5 years before they started a concerted effort of decontamination. That's way too long. That's way too long. We've got to be thinking in terms of a day, having plans in place that tomorrow, after, today's the event, tomorrow we're thinking already how to get the neighborhoods back up and running and get the economy back up and running in these contaminated areas. And so we were thinking of how would you use equipment to survey and monitor. That means, how do we know where the radioactivity is and where it's going on a daily basis? If you're in a neighborhood and the neighborhood is contaminated, but it's contaminated to low levels, and so you're still willing to live there, you're going to want to know that those levels are going to continue to be low, and hopefully they're going to drop over time. And so you may have a number of citizens who have these handheld radioactive detectors, or they're coming out. In this picture here on the bottom right is a picture of my cell phone that's using the camera to detect radioactivity. And so there are these apps that do this. The problem is that they're not very accurate, and they can lead to a lot of false positives, meaning that you think radioactivity is surrounding you, but in fact what happened is that you didn't cover the camera with enough black tape to get rid of the sunlight. And so you're just picking up sunlight and you think it's radioactivity that's harming you. So it's these types of techniques. Laying down sticky pads in the office buildings. Say you performed a decontamination. Well, everybody's a little bit weary about, is my office contaminated? You can lay down these sticky pads. So it's like sticky notes. They've got a tackiness to it. And when you say this is in the lobby, everybody walks in the lobby, everybody walks through the sticky tabs. And so their shoes are clean then when they go into the elevators. And then every day these sticky tabs can be pulled off as a sheet and then counted to see how much radioactivity is on it. And I think that would go a long way to reassuring the public that, yeah, no, your office is clean, because every single day we are monitoring the amount of radioactivity that people are tracking on their shoes, and we're not finding any radioactivity, for instance. Another one is dealing with solid waste. For this one, it's decontaminating. So for this one, how do you decontaminate to begin with? Can we use street sweepers? You know, that seems like a really good idea. If the street is contaminated, well, street sweepers are designed to clean the street, right? So wouldn't that work out really nice? Is to have a fleet of street sweepers that we have going around the city and cleaning off the streets. I'm just publishing a paper right now where we talk about where the harmful radioactivity is coming from when you have a contaminated city. And it turns out the street is more harmful than the buildings because you're walking on the street and it's very close to you. So you're getting a lot of radioactivity hitting you from the contamination that's on the street. So boy, if we can design these street sweepers or commandeer these street sweepers, and if it works, that would be great. Turns out street sweepers are not designed to clean a street. Street sweepers are designed to clean the gravel and twigs and junk off of the curb area to keep them from going into the sewers, because the sewer, the reclamation district that handles all the sewer water, they don't want all those twigs and gravel coming into the sewer system. We're doing tests right now to see if we can change the pressure and the type of water that's being sprayed out of these street sweepers and improve the ability to decontaminate, because they just aren't very good at doing that. So the next one is managing waste. We're trying to avoid this situation. So these are flimsy plastic bags that are used in Fukushima to collect initial waste that people were throwing out from their homes. So they were going back to their homes and they were cleaning up after the tsunami. They had radioactive contamination. They were just throwing everything out. And so the garbage trucks were quickly overwhelmed. And so they were telling people, they were distributing these bags and saying, just fill up these bags and leave them on your curb and we'll get to it. Well, they weren't getting to it because they were just completely overwhelmed, as you can imagine. I didn't show any pictures here of the contamination and as a result of Fukushima, but you're looking at the contamination the size of Rhode Island, you know, so it's an overwhelming situation. And they thought, okay, well, we'll package them in here. Well, it turned out it was a bad idea because the packages sat there for a long period of time. They weren't sealed correctly, so when it rained, they were collecting water, and then they were falling apart. And so then they had to be repackaged. Well, they didn't even know what was inside these packaging to begin with. They didn't even know, they didn't have the ability to scan a radioactive scan of these massive containers and know how much radioactivity is in there. Because maybe there wasn't any radioactivity in it. And why am I dealing with this suspected radioactive waste if it's not radioactive? So they didn't even know what to do with this. And so they ended up repackaging them in a much sturdier, black, thick plastic bag. And that's what this picture is. And this is only a small picture, a small view of this scene in Fukushima. And this is only one area where they're storing waste. So you can get a feel for the bags are here individually, and then the size of these trucks here. This field goes on and on. It goes on as far as the eye can see. And these are all individual bags stacked up. How many tall here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 tall. Massive number of bags. And that's what they're doing with them right now, is because they have no place to go with this contamination. They don't have a lot of room in Japan. So they're making these areas where the waste is going to sit until they figure out what are we going to do with this stuff. So we want to avoid the situation where you have crummy bags that are distributed and no plan for how to distribute and collect the waste. So maybe we can come up with much better approaches to it and learn from the Japanese experience in it. And then one of the last ones is contaminated wastewater. How do we contain the wastewater? We can divert the wastewater. In the city of Chicago, we have the deep, what do they call it? The deep tunnel project that feeds water. When we get massive amounts of rain, we dug out these massive tunnel systems to handle the overflow of rain so that they wouldn't go into the river system and into Lake Michigan. And that rainwater then sits inside of the old quarries that we have around, the limestone quarries that we have around the city of Chicago. And we can handle a lot of water with that. Well, maybe we can divert in the city of Chicago. We can wash down these buildings with fire trucks and fire hoses, wash down the buildings immediately, let it go into the sewer system, and then divert that water into the deep tunnel system until we can process all that radioactive water. So that's an idea. And so we're trying to come up with a bunch of these ideas and try to organize it in a way that we can, that people can search if they have to contain radioactive water. How do I do this? Well, we're developing a computer app that that has all of these types of objectives. How do I handle 100 gallons of water, contaminated water? How do I divert 150,000 gallons of water coming into the sewer system? How do I what types of containers can we distribute around to individual neighborhoods where people can securely deposit their suspected radioactive trash, and it stays in a secure way where the rain is not getting to it, you're not having animals burrowing into it and stuff. So we're having an app that's going to organize all of these ideas and these methods and recommendations, and we're working on that for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is under Department of Homeland Security. And we're doing it also for the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we have a bunch of these documents that we've collected all this data. We have this, the app is going to be a companion to what's called Rad Responder, which is a tool that FEMA uses to organize the response to radioactive contamination events. And so this Rad Responder has the ability to have all of these first responder agencies like the fire department and the police department. They go into a situation, they have their radiation monitors on. The radiation monitors are sending data live to Rad Responder, which is creating these live maps. And so all the responders can look at Rad Responder on their phone and they can see this map starting to form, and they know where all the radioactivity is. So they know how to move their people around to avoid the radioactive hotspots, or to alert them when they're doing life-saving operations that they are in a radioactive hotspot and they're going to have to limit their time. They go in, they come out, another shift comes in and they come out. So it's a way to manage people. And so our tool is going to be a companion to this. And so it'll have the ability then, once the emergency phase is over, they can go into the app, our decontamination and recovery app, and get some ideas on how quickly we can get the city back up and running. And we've worked on a number of other things. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is, there's a huge problem with just getting your head around the massive efforts that are required to do a response and recovery. Where do you start? Just in the decontamination. Okay, it's contaminated. You saw those maps of the computer models that show the contamination. Where do you start? Do you start on the edge and work in, or do you start in the highest socioeconomic value, which might be the downtown area? You start there and then work your way out. And even say you start here in the city and you work your way out. Well, where do you start here? Do you start cleaning the roadways first, or do we do the top-down approach and we start spraying down the buildings from the top and get down lower and move from there? Well, so what I've been thinking about is developing a 3D virtual platform. And I got the idea because I play these Black Ops and Modern Warfare games with my kids. And I was amazed at how great the graphics were. And when you turn around and you shoot the wall, you can see the damage on the wall, and the damage stays there for a little while. And I was thinking, well, this would be really kind of neat. You could develop a virtual world where you have a contamination of a city, and then you would enter into the city and plan how you would do a cleanup. And it would be built in with logistics models built in, so you would understand, if I wanted to decontaminate this is the type of equipment I would need, these are the type of people I would need, and this is the type of training. And so then the model would be able to carry out, the virtual model would be able to carry out, how long is it going to take for this equipment to arrive? How long is it going to take for me to train these people? Where am I going to train them? I'm not going to train them in the contaminated area, so I got to train them someplace else. And then when they're trained, then we've got to transport them to these areas. Well, we got to set up like a warm area where you get set up, and then and then you're transported into the hot zone so you can do the decontamination, and then you can only be there for a certain period of time, because if you're wearing personal protective equipment, then an 8-hour day, you're going to have people dropping dead from an 8-hour day. So you got to really monitor your time, and so it gives you a way of trying to wrap your head around what a response and recovery, an efficient response and recovery is going to look like. So these are some of the things we've been thinking about, as well as a number of other things. Before I finish off here, one of the things that I want to explain is, so in a typical day in my career, a typical day has evolved greatly. So when I was young, so I just got my PhD, so I was in my mid-20s, I was in the laboratory probably 30 out of 40 hours a week. And then I was writing another 20 to 30 hours a week. And that has slowly evolved into more writing and less laboratory work. And now I'm probably only a few hours a week in the laboratory, and that's mostly to do training and to check on my students and the staff people who are working on my projects. And I spend probably 95% of my time reading and writing. I do a lot of reading and writing. And no one ever told me this when I was going through school, that you're going to be doing a lot of reading and writing, Mike. But in the Department of Energy, or in any research and development organization, you do a lot of reading and writing. And Professor Ramirez, do you find that when you're not in the classroom that you spend most of your time reading and writing?
It's a little bit different where we're not a research institution. So I don't have a lot of reading and writing in the sense that I did when I was at the lab.
Okay.
But it seems like my career will head that way in a few years, that we're looking for some more undergraduate research opportunities for our students.
Oh, great.
So I'll get there.
Okay. But you certainly remember the days at Argonne where
absolutely.
you had to write your papers. And the reason why we read and write in the R&D organizations, and you have to do it when you work with industry too, is you have to report what your findings are. So even when you're doing work at an industry, say your job is to, pertaining to this talk, say your job is to manage the decontamination of a small facility in Ohio. That was making, for instance, radium watches. So they used to use radioactive radium, and paint the dials of the watch because it would glow at night. So you can see the hands of the watch at night when you were looking at your watch. So if your job is to decontaminate this facility, you're going to be reading, first of all, on the techniques that you're supposed to be using, and you're going to be developing plans based on that. And then you're going to be writing up the safety documents that describe the work and the safety measures that you're using in order to protect your workers from injury or from exposure from the radioactivity. And then when you're done, you're going to have an after action report where you're going to write the lessons learned in that facility, write that up and send it around to your management, and maybe present your work at different conferences, so that since you're going to be the subject matter expert in that, you're going to let people know what you found. This was what worked, this is what didn't work, and everybody should learn from my experience. In research and development, we do the same thing. We read all the time on what everybody's doing in the area. I didn't go into decontamination and just say, yeah, I'm going to try some decontamination. I spent weeks reading on what everybody in the entire world had done, and what kind of techniques and chemicals they had used in the previous 30 years, and tried to learn from that and build from that. And so when you're done with your review of the literature, we call it, you have a knowledge of what's the state of the art. And then in a research and development organization like Argonne, we push the state of the art, and we're right on the edge. We are the state of the art. And so we try to develop new techniques and better techniques to improve our ability to do all kinds of different things, not just decontamination. We do all kinds of things at Argonne. So, and then when you're done with your research, then you write it up in papers, and we publish the papers. And so that's what I was showing. Whoops. That's what I was showing here. For instance, we were interested in understanding decontamination, how well it works. Well, what is contamination? Well, contamination in this case the last case that I had shown with the improvised nuclear weapon and with the radioactive bomb, well, it's going to be in the form of fallout. Well, what's fallout? Well, fallout's particles. It's dust. Well, dust looks different. Different fallout looks different. And when it looks different, I mean, it actually is when you look at it under a microscope, some of them are round particles, some of them are almost look like burnt pieces of ash, and so they're flat. And they have different properties. When they land on material, they behave differently. They have different energies of interaction, and so their bonding energies become different. And so you need, if you're going to evaluate decontamination techniques, you need to have a realistic contaminant. And so we spent some time developing a realistic contaminant. And so my postdoc student, Dr. Will Jolin, and my master's degree student, Chris Oster, who's at the University of Delaware right now, they developed a technique where they took silicon dioxide, sand. They took sand, 1 micrometer, half a micrometer round sand particles, and they developed a silicate coating that had a radioactive label on it. So they had radioactivity that was on the surface of this, and then they coated over it with a layer of glass to protect it so the radioactivity doesn't bleed off the particles. And then this was our radioactive fallout. One type of radioactive fallout, surrogate we call it. It's a surrogate, it's a stand-in for a real radioactive fallout, because we don't have real radioactive fallout, thankfully. And so this is what we did a number of our tests on, was using these types of particles and spreading them onto different materials, and then looking at our ability, for instance, to pressurize wash them using pressurized sprayers, the same ones that are used in street sweepers. So that's how we evaluate whether a street sweeper works. We don't have a street sweeper, and no one's going to give us a street sweeper. So what we do is we take the specifications, the pump that the street sweepers use, the amount of water that it uses, and the pressure that pump is operating under, and we have a facility where we can do spray washing at Argonne, where we have a container that has a spray bar, and we use the same pump that the street sweeper uses, and then we spray down onto asphalt samples or concrete samples, and we can evaluate by measuring the radioactivity before on the samples and measuring them after they've been spray washed. We can determine how effective the decontamination is. So that's all I have, and I'd be interested in any questions that you have. Xavier, if you have any questions, I see Anthony Hudson, Mr. Hudson, I see you joined us. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer anything you guys have.
So what would you consider your favorite project to be in the amount of time it took for it?
Oh, okay. That's a neat question. My favorite projects had actually nothing to do with anything that I've described here today. My favorite, so like I was saying in the very beginning of the lecture, this is one area of expertise that I have that I've been pursuing my entire career. I have other areas of interest. So when I was also a young man, I was working on magnetic microspheres and nanospheres. And we were taking these things, and the reason why I got involved in it is because we were taking them and dumping them into radioactive waste tanks, simulated. We were dumping them into radioactive wastewater and then collecting all the radioactive water onto these magnetic particles. And then because they're magnetic, we can take a magnet and harvest them, collect them onto the magnet. So you have an easy way of dumping these magnetic particles into a highly radioactive tank, and then pulling the radioactivity onto a small amount of these particles by using a simple magnet. And then the tank, because you pull all the radioactivity out and now it's concentrated onto these magnetic particles, you can throw away the rest of the water inside that tank. The reason why that was important is because we have 100 million gallons of highly radioactive water in Hanford, Washington that came from the development of the nuclear weapons. So it was a massive, massive problem and a massive need. Well, I found out that these magnetic particles that we were using, they were magnetic iron oxide embedded inside of a plastic. Well, if we changed the plastic, we can make them biocompatible. So we changed them into a biocompatible plastic, turned into what we used as a polylactic acid. Lactic acids have a natural degradation cycle inside the body, so they're very benign. We made these now magnetic polylactic acid particles, and we can put all kinds of things on them. So we were putting, we were attaching chemotherapeutic agents onto them. We were attaching drugs that will cause the body to clot. So if you had internal bleeding or you had bleeding in the brain, we were developing these particles so that they could be injected into the bloodstream. And then with magnets, we could direct the magnetic particles, say, into the brain and cause the drug to release from the magnetic particles. And that way we could stop brain hemorrhaging. And so we were doing all kinds of really cool stuff. We were working with the University of Chicago, Illinois Institute of Technology, a number of other schools and hospitals on the East Coast, Rush Hospital in Chicago, in order to design these types of magnetic, we call them magnetic vectors. So they were just a platform to transport drugs or other therapeutics around the body. That was by far the neatest thing I had ever been involved in, because I was working with all kinds of different people. There wasn't anybody who was a nuclear engineer like me. And you know, I was working with biochemical engineers, bioengineers, and a lot of medical doctors. And so it was really cool. That was very, very cool. I did that for about 10 years almost.
That sounds really neat. A lot of fun.
Yeah, and Professor Ramirez, that's when we met. I was doing a lot of that research, and I was going back and forth to the University of Chicago.
Okay. I have a question. As young undergraduate students, what do you feel is the best thing that they could do to prepare themselves or expose themselves to a career in R&D?
So a career in R&D as an undergraduate, there's probably two I would suggest. So a couple of things at least. One is do well in your academics. Try to get the A in your classes, because your GPA does matter to a lot of people. Try to get experience either working in the laboratories at the school or applying for internships outside of that. That is big time. Often, if you have an internship, people won't even ask you about how you're doing in school. They're more concerned with how you did in a real life situation, because what we're really, you know, the academics is fantastic because it tells us that you have the basis theoretically to do the work, but it doesn't really tell us exactly how well you work. And I'd rather take someone who's a real go-getter and a self-starter, and has just an incredible amount of ambition at doing the job. And maybe he's a B student or she's a B student. I'll take that person over the straight A student who has no experience or whose experience and their letters of recommendation tell me that person doesn't work very hard. I have no patience for someone who's not going to work. So I think those are your two big things, is making sure that you have the academics, but you need some way of demonstrating that you're going to work hard. You have to be willing to work hard at R&D, otherwise you're not going to do well in it. It requires so much time. There's not enough time in the day. An 8-hour day is not enough to do research and development. You're going to be in the lab as much as you can be, and then you have to write and you have to read, and there's not enough time in an 8-hour day to do that. So you have to be willing to put in the extra time. But it's fun though. I mean, this is my hobby. I have a lot of other hobbies too. I'm very much into athletics. I'm very much into my boys' athletics. So I do a lot of coaching and I do a lot of playing sports myself. Science is my hobby as well. So I don't mind the extra hours. I enjoy, I mean, there's nothing as cool as figuring out a problem. I mean, yesterday I worked 11 hours. And the reason why I couldn't put it down is because I was doing these calculations and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong in these calculations. I couldn't reproduce the work that my student was doing, and it was really bugging me. And I kept going through the equations and writing them out myself. And then I finally realized exactly where I was making the mistake. And I was able to verify that all my students' calculations were correct. But you know, it's fun going through and solving problems like that, even as little a problem as checking my students' work. But you learn something by doing that, so you're always learning, and that's the fun thing about it.
Yeah, excellent point. Anthony or Xavier, do you have any other questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. And if you guys, and Professor Ramirez, if any of your students have questions afterwards, after they've seen the video, please let them know that maybe they should coordinate through you so that I don't have a bunch of random emails that I don't know who are these people from. But if they coordinate through you, I'd be more than willing to answer questions from emails, or if you want to do a follow-up conversation, I have no problem with this. I'd really like to help out your students to figure out what they'd like to do and what careers they might enjoy.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that. Okay, well, I think we'll sign off. I'll send you, it's usually a couple hours before the system posts the video.
Okay.
So I'll send you the link in the download file so that you'll have the video. Thank you so much for doing this.
Okay. Thank you very much for asking me. I really enjoy doing these types of things, Professor Ramirez. So don't hesitate to ask me again, please.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, Xavier, Anthony, you guys have a good day today. Stay safe and work hard and keep plowing, man. Keep plowing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.